Good evening.
Hey. Hello.
Oh my god, you all stood to attention. That's crazy. Okay. Is this? Can y'all hear me okay? Like
Absolutely.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Aubrey. Hi. Hi. Good evening. Cute little setting. I'm Alejandro, and thank you so much for coming. First time we're doing anything like this, little creative writing reading event from me and friends Nora and Kelvin. So, funny story. I wrote a book in my senior year of high school, and I started doing it like the year before because I was scared about the next presidential election. And I thought, okay, how do I deal with scary things? Okay, I'm gonna imagine the worst possible thing, the most unimaginable thing ever to happen, and I'm just gonna write about it. So I did. And I wrote a whole draft in my senior year of high school, and it's terrible. I don't like it. But I began working on it recently again after taking a break from it in freshman year. And I'd like to share with you a little excerpt from the end of the first chapter. So my novel is a dystopian young adult story about a near future United States with a government run by a neo-fascist, alt-right nationalist party that is waging a war on immigrants. And the plot follows our main character, Lucas, a fry cook at a fast food place that is secretly a front for an organization known as the Achillean Mafia, the United States network of anti-nationalist vigilantes. So, like I said, this scene is the ending of chapter 1, and a little bit of context. It's Lucas's 15th birthday. His parents woke him up with breakfast in bed and dropped him off at work before going to pick up his birthday cake. It's the end of his shift, and all his co-workers know something that he doesn't. Lucas hadn't yet registered that there were a pair of wide arms curling around his waist until they had picked him up off the ground and hauled him over to the opposite side of the fry kitchen just as he'd been about to walk out the door. Diego! Lucas yelled, kicking uselessly at the open air when he realized only Diego was strong enough and crazy enough to lift him off the ground. What the hell? It was in moments like this that he was unfortunately reminded that he shouldn't be so easy to pick up anymore. After all, he had just turned 15. It was amazing, when he really stopped to think about it, that he was allowed to even wear the title of monster at all. Diego clamped his hands down on Lucas's shoulders, as if afraid he'd float up and away. Lucas, you can't go back home. It's not safe. Faltering, Lucas's eyebrows furrowed. What? Diego's tone was deathly serious, and the look in his eyes was just a little bit crazy, like he'd just witnessed an ugly car crash he couldn't turn away from. Why? What do you mean? He scanned his mind for anything to indicate that Diego was just playing a practical joke, but to no avail. There was a horrible, twisty feeling deep in his gut that made him feel a little dizzy. The tension in the room permeated the air as much as the scent of the fried food they were cooking. His other co-workers, Joaquin and Rafael, pretended not to notice the conversation happening between the two of them, which Lucas didn't appreciate. But then both their pairs of eyes met Diego's, and the sudden knowledge that they were in on whatever not safe thing that had happened only made that twisty feeling in his gut worse. Come into the captain's office, all of you. As the four boys shuffled toward the office, Rafael turned around without stopping and began walking backwards to look at Lucas. Are you okay? He asked. The inside of Lucas's mouth went a little dry, hopelessly pleading for water to which he didn't have access. The words evaporated on his tongue until they got to the doorway of Aaron's office. Lucas stopped, dragged his vision up to meet Rafael's eyes, and said, You know what's going on. Rafael only looked down at his shoes. Lucas turned his head to be met with the sight of Aaron sitting at a grand desk, littered with books, binders, loose highlighters, and ballpoint pens. With his elbow resting on the surface just in front of his keyboard, Aaron glanced at his monitor with a look that screamed of a desire to kill. The instant he spotted Lucas in his office, his facial muscles relaxed while he clicked one or two things on his PC. Mobster Velasquez? What's going on? Lucas asked before he could say anything else. As if Lucas had never said anything, Aaron reached into a desk and pulled out Lucas's phone, stripped of its case, and pushed a book or two out of the way so the device could lay flat in front of him. Is there anything stored on your device that is extremely important? What is going on? Lucas repeated. Monster Velasquez, it is essential that you answer my questions first. The headache was beginning to settle in. Look, you guys are freaking me out. Is there anything stored on your device, not in the cloud, that you would hate to lose? Answer the question. Captain. 3. Aaron's hand lowered to grab something Lucas couldn't see. 2. Yes, Lucas eventually stammered out. Too bad, Aaron deadpanned, while slamming down a hammer with enough force upon the screen of Lucas's phone to turn it into a web of glass shards and cracks. The phone screen flashed with the lock screen one last time before it went out for good. Lucas was shell-shocked, mouth falling open as his eyebrows narrowed. What the hell? What are you breaking my phone for? What the hell is going on? There had better be a damn good explanation. Lucas, ICE detained your parents in a bakery in downtown Green Bay. Lucas's arms fell back to his sides. The walls around him became smaller. The twisting in his gut abruptly stopped, only to start again, even more gnawing this time. The news crashed over him in waves. Wait, you don't know what you're talking about. But my parents aren't even illegal. How long have you known about this? Once it seemed he was done talking, Aaron began to respond. I'll just take those one at a time, I suppose, he said. I do know what I am talking about. I am the High Captain of the Achillean Mafia. I always know what I am talking about. We cannot let you go home, because there are currently ICE agents in front of your home waiting for you. Your parents are, most likely, undocumented. It is rather common for young children with undocumented parents to not be told of their documentation status. And we have known since about 10:30 this morning. Lucas stared blankly at his coworker's face, the words and syllables and phonemes coming out of his mouth blurring into a sea of incomprehensibility. But the only question he could bring himself to ask was, so, where are my parents? Aaron inhaled through his nostrils and exhaled through his mouth, and then Lucas heard Joaquin sighing behind him. Diego said, they're in detention right now, which means jail, and if they really are undocumented, they'll probably be sent. He gesticulated vaguely with one hand instead of finishing his sentence. Of course, he didn't have to finish it. Lucas knew. Lucas had seen pictures, videos, and first-hand accounts of the concentration camps run by the Nationalist Party, harrowing things that his parents had always said were never supposed to happen in the United States. His dad would always talk to him about how the things they showed in the news today were too damn similar to what he'd read in college about the Holocaust. Fascist was the word Lucas's mother had once used to describe the new president, a disturbingly young politician hailing unfortunately from Green Bay. In the time he spent as a simple fry cook in a restaurant the Achillean Mafia operated, he'd heard some stories, mostly from Diego and Joaquin, about the horrors the other factions of the Achillean Mafia had to deal with on a daily basis. As far as this nationwide network of vigilantes went, his job was rather boring, so maybe he'd been able to delude himself into thinking he was safer than he really was. The earth began to spin. The walls closed in even more. The lights looked brighter than they had a few seconds ago. Legs disintegrating, suddenly he was looking at the ceiling. The following moments were fuzzy. Maybe he blinked back to life. Maybe Diego had picked him up again and carried him through a door, and then there was a lot of walking until he was laid down somewhere. Maybe he cried. Maybe he asked where his parents had gone one more time. Maybe he said that his head was splitting. Maybe his whole body would split down the middle and all of this would soon be over. In any case, he couldn't ever be completely sure of what had happened next. Lucas Velasquez suddenly couldn't be sure about anything anymore. Thank you guys for listening. Time check. Oh, I'm doing great. Okay. Do you have any questions? Norma? Were my characters inspired by real life people? So hilarious story. Not really, but also kinda. So I started creating this story. I came up with this story in August 2020, while the presidential election of that year was still ramping up to its conclusion, and I was looking for a way to cope, right? And so again, I just imagined the worst possible scenario and said, I'm just going to write that. And then I thought, well, there'd be a team of people trying to work against the things that the new government's doing. So I envisioned the kind of people that would be essential to that team operating. And then I had one extra person who was totally not cut out to live this life and who was like super soft and just wanted to like stay home all day and like read books. And that soft boy became Lucas. And the others became the other four characters that were in the story. So yeah. Thank you for your question. Brenda?
So since this is the worst thing that you could imagine, did it help? Like by writing this, did it actually help?
I think it helped because I had something new to look forward to, I guess. You know, like this novel's my baby, right? I care about it a lot. I think about it a lot. So yeah, I would say that it definitely helped. You know, writing always helps. It's kind of my life. So, but you know, what also helped is the fact that the other president wasn't reelected. You know, that was great too. So yeah. Amanda.
I just want to know about the process of writing a novel. Did you start with the draft? Did you just start writing?
So like I said, I came up with the idea in August 2020, but I didn't actually write it. I didn't start and finish writing the first draft until my senior year of high school, which started in September 2021, and then done in like March of 2022. And so what I ended up doing was just letting the characters live in my head for like the better part of a year, because characters are my favorite thing. They're my favorite thing about writing is like inventing a character and like getting to know them and making them a real person. So I actually had to wait a really long time before I started actually penning the first draft. But then, you know, I was entering my senior year and I needed to have some sort of a senior project. And I thought, well, use this time to learn about my favorite thing in the world and practice it on a daily basis. And so when I did that, I made an outline, and then every day I just wrote as much as I could until I got to the end. Please. Jackie?
I know you said you're like rewriting it and you're not happy with like the draft you wrote when you were senior.
Yeah.
In rewriting it, are there like a lot of things that you're changing, like plot wise, or is there anything that you're like super excited about?
Yeah, so I've been telling people that I'm rewriting it, but recently I was talking to this guy who was like my mentor during my senior project, and he said, "Don't rewrite it. That's so much work. Just tweak the first draft." And I thought, fantastic idea. So I'm looking at the first draft again now, and there are definitely things about it I want to change, especially in the beginning. So I think what I'm most excited about is to sort of expand the beginning to focus on like the characters' relationships outside of periods of time when they're in crisis. Because I felt like for my case, it jumped almost too quickly into moments of crisis, and I kind of wanted to see a little bit longer how they were just as like in a normal situation. Yeah. Professor Rabin?
Yeah, I'm fascinated with people who are capable of writing dialogue and to have characters have this, you know, character specific. So do you hear like dialogue in your head, or do you listen to dialogue and then write it down? Like, how do you do this? And do you hear different characters emerge in your head?
That's a really good question. I think dialogue. I don't think I'm especially great or bad at it. Some writers say like, "Oh, I'm really bad at writing dialogue," or like, "Oh, dialogue is one of my better strengths." But I've never really put that much thought into it as a actual skill. But for the most part, with dialogue, I think the majority of it comes from who I decide when I decide who they are as a character, like as a person, because you know the way somebody speaks tells you so much about who they are, right? And so I never decide the way a character speaks until I know who the character is. And you know, sometimes I'll be hanging out with friends, or I'm in class, or I'm scrolling through TikTok and somebody says something that sticks out to me because it sounds exactly like something the character would say, and I write it down, secretly. So yeah. Thank you, Jessica. When I have to say that the first draft was done, it's a lot, just a lot. But it is really like just so rewarding. I think that's the best part. Really, you know. Minnie?
How have like different classes before you met Hamilton like influenced you or are kind of influenced how you didn't choose your job or really at all?
Did you say how different classes at Hamilton?
Yeah, and people you met, like stories or like worldviews.
Yeah, 100%. Funny story actually. So Professor Rabbit is here with us tonight, and she teaches a class called Holocaust Lit and Built. And I took that class exclusively because I was working on the second draft of this novel, and I thought, ooh, class about the most famous instance of genocide and fascism in recent history. I'm going to take that and learn about it, and I learned so much. And the things that I learned in that class I'm going to carry with me forever. And they definitely got like the gears turning about like more specifically like world building and how specifically this like nationalist party government works. And then as for like the people here, like yeah, I have met so many different people at Hamilton that like have different backgrounds and different stories. That just like, and I just think to myself like that's really really interesting. Like there should be a book about this. There should be a movie about this. There should be like this is a story that needs to be heard, right? And so I just I don't know that not all of the stories that I hear around Hamilton are like, ooh, this is going into this specific book, right? It's a distant dream of mine to write a sitcom about my life someday. So I think that there are a lot of people that I run into that I think Tom will go crazy for you. Like it's like I think that you would be that you have a story that more people should hear. So yeah.
So when I go to a gallery of young artists, it's once they're done, they don't want to part with their
Yeah.
art.
Mhm.
How did you feel once you finished the book? How did you feel?
So I got a little taste of that feeling when I finished the first draft of my book, and it was really really weird because it's like oh it's done, right? It's kind of similar to the feeling you get when you finish binge watching a TV show and you're like, what do I do with my life? It's kind of like that, except like you are the only person who has ever binge watched this show, and you also wrote it and shot it and directed it and starred in it. Like it's so like it's just so much because it's such a self-contained sort of like journey that you go on. Even if people know about the book that you were writing, even if people read some of it, only you have ever spent as much time with this book as you have, right? And of course, when it goes out into the world, that might change depending on how enthusiastic fans become about it. But yeah, I think that the feeling of like when it's done is like it's exciting. But since I haven't gotten to like the greater dream of like, oh, it's getting published, ooh, people are buying it. Like, I don't really know what that's like yet. And even like before I came up here, I was like, ooh, people are gonna hear this thing that I started writing 2 years ago with you. But as I started getting into it, it was like more relaxing. It's like, ooh, this feels right. So I think it'll be a fun feeling. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. My name is Norma Callejas. I'm a sophomore. I started writing like sophomore year of high school, mostly poetry. That's mostly my forte. But I didn't start writing short stories until last year when I took a creative writing class. So now I've kind of gotten into it. Not sure if I'm still good at it, but I really like this short story that I'm gonna read to you guys because I feel like so far it's been one of my best works. The short story is kind of personal to me, and I just hope you guys really like it. It's based on true events, and I feel like I got so inspired by it that I had to write about it, which is very different from my poetry, which is also, most of my poetry is based on true events as well, but they're more harder to digest for some people, while this story is a little bit more lighthearted. So I hope you guys enjoy. There was once a princess, an elf, and a fairy. Different stories, different lives, but one thing in common. So as they followed the red string, they found themselves. There was a princess so enchanting, so voracious for life. Many found themselves by her side. She walked the prairies smiling and laughing, holding the hands of those she thought found an instant connection with her. But she was wrong. Those who held her hand or brought her in for an embrace wanted to take everything from her. They would shine their fake smiles at her, and as she found herself stuck in that whirlpool over and over again, she thought there was no escaping from it. So she held on even if it was eating her from inside. She held on and kept walking the same cycle, even when she found herself in strange, new land in a very small village. An elf so changing as the skies of day roamed the forest with the other lovely creatures. Though this elf learned soon enough how to change her skin, to wear different hats as those around her changed for the worse. The elf would wear red and shed words as if they were swords and arrows, until they reached deep into the dove's heart. But then the elf learned to find themselves. The elf went back to wear her green hat and to choose her words wisely. She listened and learned from the dove that she so carefully healed and brought back to life. She mimicked the way of words and to be delicate. The elf grew, maybe not in height, but in spirit. Though the elf found herself still changing hats as she left her dear forest for that of a small village. In a garden on the far side of the ocean's home, a fairy was born. But she was just a tad different from all the colorful fays in her town. She was born as dark as the black night sky, wings twice her size, and you could have mistaken her for ravenkin, hair long and in spirals, shielding her body. Yet her eyes are what took every fairy by surprise. Big pools of deep dark chocolate orbs on her childish face, which never phased to change as she grew older. All the sparkly pink, purple, blue, yellow-hued fairies would pick at her and call her names. She could only run and hide, and found sanctuary amongst water, walking, dancing, singing on top of the calm, reflected mirror. Her wings told her to take flight as she pirouetted over and over again. But she couldn't, for her wings were chained to the ground because of her evil father. So instead she sang to find freedom somewhere within her. As she grew older and found her wings unchained, she learned to fly, but found it hard, until she landed in that small village with not so long hair. The fairy had met the elf briefly before their arrival to a house made of bricks and stone in the small village. The fairy thought there was a chance with the elf, for a friendship, for her to find what truly means, especially in a place where her big wings and block aura wasn't much of a thing. Though the fairy found herself afraid and avoided the elf at first, mostly because the elf did many things the fairy did, but better. The fairy was ashamed of her gifts that when seen side by side to the elf were outshined. So the fairy hid in the shadows. Then the whispers started happening, and the fairy, although involuntarily at first, and mostly joining out of pure blinded intuition, joined in. The elf, much to the fairy's dismay, did not know what she did wrong. What had she done? She realized her hat had changed color without her knowing. Her distress had followed her from miles away. The forest curse was still upon her, and she had allowed that to blind her when it came to those close to her. She thought that it would all go away once she left the house of bricks and stone. The princess found herself down the hill with 2 cases, looking at the small, white, cottage-looking house. She took a deep breath and went inside with the help of Mother Dearest, and a beast's turn came too soon. After a long day of unpacking and spending time with her parents, the princess was ready to start a new journey in the little village. As she embarked on her 4-day trip, a delicacy all those in the village got when joining, she met a knight with armor that shone brightly. Sadly, the princess did not know that the armor this particular knight wore wasn't of true hard steel, nor was it the shiniest, but her devotion to him blinded her. His fake pearly smile would enchant her, and she would find herself running to his arms, even though he would always fail to catch her. Her knight wasn't the only one leaving her behind, but news got around, and the princess learned that her Beast King father died. Although the princess never learned to love him, the pain of watching someone else leave almost destroyed her. The club she joined was made out of backstabbing princes, dukes, and duchesses. Their sickly sweet smiles and deep pockets were only for show, and she, unfortunately, fell for the trap. It was her hometown all over again. The story, the curse, found itself back to her, and as she looked down at her hands, she realized she was no princess after all. Her perfect pink frilly dress became dull and brown, her eyes stopped shining, and her smile faded away, just like everyone else. Her knight never came back. Those she called friends from the club whispered behind her back, and the whispers caught up to her. For what could she say that would change their minds about her? Nothing. Nothing at all. So instead she locked herself in the cottage and studied away, hoping that the books would help her escape once again. The elf found herself in front of a different house of stone. She prayed that this house would be different, but her story did not budge. The elf's hat still shone bright red, even when she stayed silent with her head down. A plea that she surrendered, but the hat would not budge. The elf thought maybe she could find someone to understand her. So she went on a quest. In this quest, she came across a frog so green she couldn't help herself but to pity it. She reached out her hand, and as if the frog could sense her benevolence and want to help, it jumped on her hand. The elf smiled and pressed her lips to the frog's head as a sign of friendship. This frog then leaped and transformed into a man, strange looking, sad, and short. The elf was appalled, but nevertheless she stayed. She didn't know that this frogman would only make her hat shine brighter red. The frogman at first seemed to be fine. He would cling at her and try to find hospice with her. But as time went by, the frog became possessive, and the elf could only listen and follow. She no longer possessed control of who she was or what she did. The curse that she had imposed on others had come back to bite her. Whenever she tried to run, the frogman would find her and would whisper to her that she was his hero, the only thing he had, and if she left, he would disappear. The elf was scared, and her hat wasn't changing. So if leaving him meant hurting him, it also meant she would forever be known as evil and cruel. And so she stayed, and stayed, and stayed. Everywhere she went, she felt disconnected and out of touch. It wasn't until one day she saw her reflection that the elf woke up from the dream. This is not me. So the elf ran away. The frogman cried as he reverted back to his toad-like stage. Out of rage, or maybe out of embarrassment, the frog never came back to the village. He hopped far, far away where the elf never saw him again. So when the elf went back to the inn to get a warm, big breakfast, she saw a squire sitting by himself, admiring the silence. The elf sat in the chair in front of him and spoke. "Hi!" Little did she know that this too tall, unaware of his surroundings squire would be her greatest friend yet. Ooh, just in time. 20 minutes for questions. Yes.
I had it, and I completely forgot it.
It's all cool. Yes.
So, did you think of the fairy tale theme first and then come up with a narrative, or did you already have ideas of the like how you wanted the characters to be, and then made it into like a fairy tale?
It's kind of funny actually. So the people that this story is based off, we kind of had like little nicknames for each other's, which is the princess, the fairy, and the elf. And it kind of just unwrapped itself from there. And that's when I decided to like write the story in a fairy tale setting because it just made sense. Rather than having to write it in a more like bibliographic way, I felt like the fairy tale setting made it more lighthearted, and instead of making it into a sad story, it was almost kind of like there's a journey, but you have to like wait to get there.
So for your writing process, do you feel like you're more of an outliner, or do you feel like you more so like go by like the seat of your pants?
I'm more spontaneous when it comes to my
Yeah.
writing. I don't really have like a process per se. Like I feel like when I have a process, it just becomes a big mess for me. So I'd rather just start the writing and then tweak it from there.
So I read some of your poetry and it was very hard to write. So this story is very different, right?
Yeah.
Do you prefer one or the other?
I feel like with my poetry, it's more emotion based. It's very much more like how I'm feeling, or what I'm trying to portray, or trying to like get out of my system kind of way. And I feel like this short story is more like I'm trying to kind of like share the story of others, so that they can understand in a sense that it's really not just like you hear this and that's what makes them that. It's rather more like there's much more to this person or this person's story. You just have to like be willing to hear it. I feel like if I wanted to be more personal about myself, I would choose my poetry. But if it's something more where I want to relay a message, I'd rather type it out as like a short story.
What did you find was like the hardest part of writing that?
Getting all the details right. I feel like there were times where I only knew like the superficial parts, and I had to kind of like ask for more information to really like portray the other people's like story. Because there were some parts that were much more easier to write because they were based off of my story. But the people who weren't me, I wanted to make sure that I was telling their story right and not just superficially. Yes.
Yeah, one more question. How did you feel after writing this?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the first time I finished, I think it was like 2 paragraphs, like really big chunks of paragraphs. When I finished writing it, it felt really nice. It felt like I got to understand the other people more and myself better and how our stories intertwined. Um, it felt very magical, which was kind of the point because it's a fairy tale, kind of. But then as I kept writing, it just kept feeling more right. Like this short story needs to be completed, or I don't feel complete. Yeah. Mhm.
It was really beautiful. So I just want to say that first of all. I really liked it.
Thank you.
Also, do you think you want to keep writing in this like short story format going forward, or like something longer, or like your poetry again, or like what do you kind of think?
I haven't actually thought about that. I would say that because of my creative writing class last year, I've become more comfortable writing short stories. So I actually do think in the future I would keep writing more short stories. But I feel like I always come back to poetry because that's just like where I've become the most comfortable. But I wouldn't be like opposed to the idea of writing more short stories. Did you remember, Jody?
No, but no, but I kind of have one like branching off of that.
Mhm.
So you said that you enjoy writing poetry more. Would you ever write like a collection of poetry, like and make it a book?
Actually, that's kind of already started. um, yeah, I definitely thought about like making like a collection of like short poems, and I've kind of already started that process. It's just about getting it all together, like oh,
Chronologically.
that. Yes.
All right.
How we flowing, y'all?
Chilling.
All right, there we go. That's good. My name is Calvin Nunez. I'm a senior, of course, here at Hamilton. And I'm just very proud and very excited to be speaking tonight for this creative writing event that OP's hosting. You know, it's really awesome, and I think this is definitely a tradition that can come for semesters to come, for years to come. And yeah, and before I start, I would like to especially highlight someone who's been really important with my senior thesis project, who's helped me so much. I would love to highlight Brenda Davis, who's been basically my go-to person. We meet every Monday. We're always talking about new ideas, new things, how to get everything done. And I just can't, I can't imagine this year without you. So I really appreciate you. So let's give a little hand. Okay. Of course. And like I said earlier, this is a reading from my senior professor project where I am writing a novel, adapting that novel as if it was an animated picture, but more so an animated trailer, and then making a soundtrack album for that. And it's been a good amount. A lot's been happening. But I'm excited to share a second half from one of my earlier chapters from my first draft of this one. And yeah, I shall start. ¿Qué haces ahora? Asked Junior. He tentatively placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Sigo esperando, said the boy, matter-of-factly, as if he had been biding his time all along. The boy closed his eyes with great effort to keep them sealed and began channeling his breaths. ¿Para quién? Said a weather voice to Junior's left. Out of the path came Mama Lela, dressed in a black dress. Her white hair, now a mix of gray and black, loose like long flowing vines, a look on her face he was not accustomed to. Junior stood paralyzed as cobwebs swarmed at his mouth. Behind her eyes, he saw life, recognition, and trepidation. This was no dream. Mama analyzed the scene before her before motioning Junior to come by her side. The same dreary and soothing whistle picked up again at his side. Junior looked down at the boy, who had his eyes closed once again and rose to the tips of his toes. Junior's hesitation made Mama's hand move more desperately. The boy had let her question fade off into the air. Junior, ven para acá, she said, biting through her words. Junior rushed over to her but couldn't predict her actions as they looked at one another. On close examination, Mama looked rather the same, if maybe a bit younger, as her pale skin looked nourished, but she still had her fair share of wrinkles and blemishes. She tugged on his sleeve and spoke directly into his ear. Estamos muertos, she deadpanned to him, and he bursted out a thumping hump. No, interrupted the child with still shut eyes. Él está cansado. Ya casi viene. The boy went back to whistling, even more intensely than before, and this time the sound threatened to snap their ears off. Even Mama Lela had to cover her rarely functioning ears and scamper away from the tornado of sound swirling around the boy. She held her arm to Junior and began tugging him away from the area. Junior pulled away and yelled to overcome the wind shaking the crackling floors. Espérate, él está aquí solo. Something inside him said they shouldn't go. Junior, ¿por qué estamos aquí? She seemed shaken and grabbed her grandson's arm forcibly this time and put him behind her. She shielded his body even though Junior towered over her. He watched her bravery in awe. Mamá Lela readied herself and raised her cross. No sé, él estaba aquí haciendo bulla hasta que yo vine también. Él trabaja mucho para su familia. Junior struggled to explain and trailed off. He pointed to the stack of wood that had remained unlit. His grandmother began whispering quickly to herself. Mamá Lela's gaze stuck to the boy like sap. Her hands started to move in signs of the cross, and her prayer beads began to drip blinding gold shavings of mist. Junior's eyes widened as she hovered her glowing hand in the boy's direction. The stories of his grandmother curing illnesses and asthma shot to the forefront of his mind. His mom always joked that she did have a little bit of magic in her, but Junior never believed it. Her movements made him snap out of his stupor. Junior pushed his grandmother's hand and yelled, "Mama, no!" She snapped at him to keep quiet as she kept the charged energy as protection in front of them. The little boy opened his eyes and stopped whistling. Mama Lela dropped her hands and her face twitched in the disbelief of recognition. Seconds passed as the pair locked eyes and absorbed one another. Tears began to stream down Mama Lela's cheeks. Roots of trees cracked in the distance as the world around them deteriorated further. Their plane of reality was threatening to come crashing down. Ay Dios, pero eres tú, de verdad, Mama Lela said in between huffs as she reined in her sobs. The boy smiled and nodded his head. He ran into her arms and jumped into her embrace. Mama Lela smoothed his hair and fixed his suit the best she could. Vision collided in his mind as the forest around them toppled further. The boy looked at them both and nodded. The trees crashed down like demolition and thundered into destruction. The ground shook and the three of them huddled together. Junior put his body as their shield and branches smacked his skin. As the rubble settled, he stood up cautiously and surveyed their new surroundings. The trees sunk into the earth and tombstones replaced their presence. Crumbling garden stones with their family name, Ruiz, and their other family lines of Cruz, Nunez, and Perez populated the yard. The graveyard that Junior had visited for the first time yesterday, replicated perfectly in this room, continued to crackle and fall apart with shards of the outer edges beginning to fall forward onto the earth. Mama slowly arose with her arms hugging herself. Nothing was left in her arms. The breeze roared. Footsteps crunched in the gravel behind them, and they spun to meet the invader. Junior and Mama stood face to face with his ghost. Papa Rico, now a man, stood quivering in the cold, and while his slight 5'7" cocoa bean frame always had been lean, this suit looked even looser than the last. The old man's features looked even more decrepit than the day he died. His cheekbones further jutted out from his face, his skin wrapped tightly around his bones. Mama Lela giggled, a small opening of joy that snowballed into an avalanche of hysteria as she cackled and wrapped herself tightly around her man. Payaso tú, she murmured through her tears into his chest. Sí, eras tú. Mi intención no fue lastimarte, solo proteger a Junior. Tú sabes, he esperado por tu visita, pero te demoraste mucho. Yo pensé que algo iba mal y yo no sé qué pasa, Mama rambled as she poured her emotion into a truly manic state of love. By his grandparents' embrace, Junior stood stapled by his guilt in the ground. The apology in his throat strangled him, and a new migraine beat against the windows of his skulls. He never knew what to say. Junior's eyes blinked heavily, and every time he found them closer and closer until he had unconsciously joined in their hug. The guilt could not explain anything, and he was too scared to speak, but he hoped his body could bridge some type of gap. Lela, yo la extrañé tanto. Estoy bien cansado, Papa Rico's voice grated like sandpaper. Every word and effort in a wheeze like a man on his last breath. He never talked anywhere this scratchy. Nonetheless, the tenderness he spoke with, Junior had seldom heard before. Tuve que verlos a los dos otra vez. The world crackled around them, and Papa heaved as the words became harder for him to force out. Mama Lela grabbed his arms and patted his back. Stress screamed and contorted the fabrics of her face as she wore all of her concern. Dinos, Rico, ¿qué está pasando? ¿Por qué te estás desapareciendo tan rápido? Tu alma pasó al más allá. Her speech noticeably accelerated as she held him up. Junior grabbed onto his grandfather, who felt lighter than a hair clip, with flaking skin which was cold to the touch. Papa nodded with great fatigue, and the suffering he was in brought warm tears to Junior's eyes. The old man's journey, led by his younger self, had little time left. Whatever had occurred to him, whatever this was that was in front of them, the sight of this once great man tormented mentally and physically tore Junior's heart apart. If he really traveled to see them, then Junior couldn't imagine what he was running from. No matter whether dead or alive, fear attacks us all. There's always something greater to terrify us, to despise, to abhor, to pray for protection against. Papa coughed, hacking out anything left inside his body. As his spirit battled, the realm continued to fracture. Soon the walls of the world were bound to collapse anew, bringing down the rest of the moon, sky, and forest on top of them. Rico, quédate conmigo. ¿Qué está pasando? ¿Cómo podemos ayudar? ¿Cómo te sacamos de aquí? Mi alma, Lela, Papa Rico said in between gasps, as he coughed out dark acidic pus that steamed into the air upon touching the earth. The rotten, infected smell churned Junior's stomach, and if he had anything in that pit, he would have refunded it. Junior faltered in holding him up, but my mom more than made up for his temporary lapse in concentration. Mi alma ha sido robado. Ustedes dos fue enviado con toda la fuerza que queda. Por favor. Another hacking cough, and now it was a race against time. Papa's old dress shoes were slowly devoured as they sunk into the earth. Rico, dinos cómo restauramos tu alma, Mama pleaded, as they struggled to keep his head above the surface. The more they pulled, the harder the earth sucked him in. Papa pushed them off and let himself go. With his last scribble of strength, with his last gasps, he delivered their instructions to save his stolen soul. En la tierra, ve a la tierra, llévate a Junior, él tiene mi bendición. Crea tu destino, y the soil poured into his eyes and swept him underneath in a puff of dust. The mourners released blood-curdling screams lost to the detonation of the realm. Ashes rained and piercing white light flew around them as the world slowed down in its implosion. Particles drifted as sweat, sawed, flesh, and bark swirled around in dizzying pirouettes around Junior until the sounds all boomed together and the vacuum swallowed them whole, into a space that let nothing escape. Light nor sensation nor sound reached him for a time that might have been as long as the spine of a desert or as short as the distance between the gears of a wristwatch. When he came to, he found himself back in his bed in La Vega. A soft glow shone through the curtain, and it could not have been any later than the wee bit hours of the morning. A calm settled in his bones that he had never sniffed before. In a trance-like state, his legs began to move. Junior arose from the bed. No sounds filled the space but the hum of the electricity that the generator provided. Mama Leila's bed lay vacant. Brandon's birdcage opened, and the door still slightly swung. The outside world whispered to his feet. Once he entered the hallway, light orange dust settled in his vision, emanating from the doorframe to his left. Without word, Junior strided to the door and pushed it open. Refreshing air filled his lungs, and his mind cooled to the clutch of an ice cube. The path in front of the house that led up the hill was completely fogged out. The orange hue comforted Junior, and he began his way forward onto the road. As the colors settled in his vision, the scent and feel of soft dew squished under his feet. The exposure of his eyes settled, and the world brightened around him. In front stood a world of antiquity. Vibrant greens glossed every corner in a dense rainforest, with no traces of humanity. The cool calmness sadly retreated from him and panic built anew. The quiet had no longer comforted him, and the eerie silence provoked his sleep-deprived mind. Whooshes in the distance sped, and Junior caught what looked like to be the tail of a falling comet. As the object sped closer to him, he saw humanoid features on a blue blob that looked just as shocked to see him and flew away faster. Soon more blobs would pass by him, in a strange valley of traffic, much faster than even the one before. Junior wished himself awake once again and covered his ears in stressful agony. His hope that the past had just been visions proved terribly wrong. A small tap on his shoulder pulled him back to the present. Mamá huevo, pero muévete, hay que salvar a Rico, a deep, suave voice said to him. As Junior peered to his left, Brandon, in all of his green, fugly colors, was now 4 feet tall and shredded to all hell like a pure Roman Olympian. That sight took Junior in as his body lost all stability and he flopped forward onto the hard roots of the ground. Amalela just shook her head and laughed. And that is the end of that. Any questions? No?
Was your story inspired by like a musician, like Latin American? Like, I know we've talked about this before, but it just like your story reminds me of a lot of like the others Nicholas and like. So I was just wondering if you were inspired by like certain traditions.
Yeah, definitely. Growing up as a Dominican American, you always hear stuff. Like what I put in there, like with grandmas who can like cut someone's hair and then instantly someone's asthma's gone away. Like that actually happened. Like it happened to my sister. I think it happened to me, but I don't know if my asthma came back or something. Lately asthma, But it's just things like that you pick up. Even small things like, oh, your cousin was almost stolen by a witch when he was a baby. That's crazy. Like I want to know more about that. I want to know why people talk about that. And when you get to learn more about your culture and unravel all the stories that lie there, all the supernatural stuff, it's really interesting, and it's definitely inspired by that. A lot of the book actually, and the whole project is inspired by a lot of Dominican folklore. So Dominican folklore has some really scary stuff in there. A lot of it's in there. So it's just things like that, which has really been really interesting to learn more about, to talk with my family about, and just to feel more connected to my culture and to have more stories to tell people. So it's pretty cool.
Is this like a coming of age story?
Yeah, it's a coming of age story inspired by something that happened to me. So for someone who grew up, my Spanish was very shaky growing up. I'm saying like full blown like no sabo, like it was bad. For me, I always end up, I feel like, writing about my life, like my identity and what that entails. And when I got the opportunity or to think about what a senior fellowship could look like with the story, I think I had thought of, it went back to an experience I had in like 2021 after losing my grandfather, and feeling a little guilty that I didn't say goodbye because I was scared to speak in Spanish. And that's something that I've always held on to. That's still something I still feel ashamed from. But after some other events, like even like this kind of like dream kind of scenario, it didn't exactly happen how I wrote it, but something like that where I was able to see him and my grandmother in the same spot. Things like that, I felt like there was definitely a story to talk about. To also like get a way to touch on his life and his triumphs, what he did, and to also connect to like that coming of age story of what you realize when you're growing up as a Dominican American or as a child of Latino immigrants. It's a hard world, but as long as you just try your best to bridge the gaps that you see and to talk when you can, I think that's really what you can ask of yourself. So it definitely is like that sense of coming of age, of connecting back to your culture and of paying homage to your grandparents.
So I have an observation and a question. The observation is that your Spanish was very smooth.
Yes. Yeah, that's good.
And the other, as we talked about writing and film and music, do you have a preference most enjoy the most?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Growing up, I always like floated towards poetry, and then that became like music. So I'd say like that's typically the one I feel like is most accessible and easiest to get into. Um, so when it came to like writing like a novel and like what I'm doing here, it was definitely a really big twist. But I knew there were some parts of my writing that I wanted to keep, like like the descriptions or just like the imagery. I wanted to make sure that that stayed. And then it's been really cool seeing like how decisions I make for a novel maybe don't translate to an album or don't translate to a trailer. So that part of like creating the senior fellowship and all those different sides of adapting across the mediums and just like storytelling in general has been really cool. But I would definitely say poetry and music is where my heart will always be first.
What did you choose to put the dialogue in Spanish?
Great question. I was in my creative writing class when I was first working on this last year, spring semester, and that was a big thing that kept becoming like a recurring issue. It was like, do I just like write this in English? Like, do I put the dialogue there, or do I translate it? Do I put footnotes? Um, and a part of me thought that was just kind of like that would like lose some of the essence. I feel like of what I've had to come with my whole life, which is like it's a whole different language. Like it's kind of unavoidable, and it's something where um I can't imagine my life without Spanish, for good or bad. But it was something where I was like, if I keep it, I feel like it would ring more true. And then the class definitely had some opinions as well, but I think staying with the Spanish has really lent as well to like the voices, because there's some things that also just don't translate. It's like a grandma scolding you or like all this other stuff. It might not translate exactly the same, or different words have different meanings. So that's where the decision came from. It was really early in the process. Hmm?
So I remember the first summer that I met you, and I remember you telling me that you wanted to be a storyteller. That was something that you really, that was already part of what you wanted to do. And I'm wondering where that started. Like how early before you got your college you realized that you wanted to tell stories. And I'm also wondering if you ever thought at that point when you started college that you'd be up here doing this fellowship and all this.
No, the last part definitely not. But I think storytelling, it just came as you're a young kid, you're like trying to figure out what you like to do, and I just always found myself really liking details, but it didn't connect with me fully how much I liked stories until I wrote this like weird poem in like eighth grade about like a pencil, because I was just like, what if a pencil had like its own life, its own views, its own everything? No one's considering that. So I think the storytelling was definitely a very natural progression. It just came from a very random moment, but I'm really thankful for it. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I don't know what the ending procedure is, but I would love to thank everyone for coming tonight. And I think you're gonna go ahead and thank everyone. For all the planning that it took, and like I said, I absolutely see this being a tradition that we do for many more semesters going forward. And I hope you have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.